Great beast of a creature, great dragon, how we do immortalize you so. We do, in actual fact, see the dragon as almost the icon, if you like, of fantasy role-playing. It doesn't matter whether you're playing in a Lord of the Rings game or whether you're playing fantasy on high. The dragon is going to be, well, pretty much everywhere. Why do we love these creatures so? Why is it that these simple beasts have captured our imagination? Of course, the game Dungeons and Dragons did a huge amount for their PR, so they've obviously got a very good marketing department. But the dragon it's something, isn't it? I mean, there's a majesty, a terror, there's a power, they're pretty nice. Right? They're pretty nice. So today sees me launching a new series for you guys, which is called Monsters and You. So Monsters and You is where I explore certain universal monsters, so not necessarily those related to a specific setting. We might look at a rancor or two, but Whompers are certainly out. We might look at kobolds and the undead, but, well, maybe we won't go into the specific types of demons that exist within a campaign. So again, this is your opportunity to sit back, look at how I want to discuss these creatures, and then give me feedback as to whether you think that there is merit in the way that I'm doing it, or if you'd prefer me to do something else. As usual, all the videos are system agnostic, so we won't be talking about armor class or hit points or thresholds or anything along those lines. This video is purely about how to use these creatures from a narrative perspective and how we can make them just that much more interesting. And that, for me, is ultimately the goal that we have here today. Now, when we look at creatures, we're going to start off with the dragon. We have to. I mean, they are spectacular, spectacular beasts. Now, like with settings, the very first thing we have to look at is, what does everyone expect when they come to dragons? When they're about to fight a dragon, what do they expect? Now, in some systems, dragons are given different ages, so a young dragon is not as experienced as an adult dragon is not as powerful as an ancient dragon, and an ancient dragon isn't as powerful as the great worm, the greatest and most ancient and most venerable of them all, the true monster of the skies. Or at least that's what they are supposed to be. Whether they actually turn out to be that way is a different story. So people expect dragons to be big, they expect them to be powerful, and they expect them to be incredibly old. And there's a reason for that. Dragons are the masters of their realm. There is almost no other creature that springs to mind immediately, apart from one or two which are very system specific, that rivals the majesty and the awesome power of a dragon. So people are expecting dragons in your world, in your setting, to be these epic creatures. Now, whether you subscribe to the idea that there are different coloured dragons, there's red, green, white, gold, brass, bronze, in the old days, amethyst, emerald, sapphire, those kinds of different colours and types of dragons, shadow dragons, sand dragons, cloud dragons, whatever types of dragons you have, they all command majesty. They all command respect, or at least so they should. Now, that means that you as the game master have to make sure that these beasts are suitably as enigmatic, as powerful, and as all-knowing as we expect them to be. Now, oftentimes, whilst we're looking at the expectations of dragons, we'll need a big bad and we'll go, oh, it's a dragon. All right, good, it's a dragon. What we don't look at any further is, why would the dragon be doing this particular thing? And what are other dragons doing about it? Now, this is something on how to make the creatures more than what we just expect. A dragon isn't just a fierce combatant with lots of power. there's more to it than that, or at least there should be, and if there isn't, then this is something that will certainly help you to make your dragons that much more interesting. So, dragon society, what is it in your world? Where do the dragons fit in? How do they participate within the space? Are they like Smaug and those terrible, terrible beasts from Lord of the Rings, where they're just these infernal terrors that have no particular hierarchical structure amongst themselves and they're isolationist? Or do they form into some larger organization, an ancient council of worms, to go back to a second edition box set, actually, which allowed players to actually play dragons? It was a fantastic, fantastic setting if you wanted to explore creating a society of these godlike beings. And that's the question, is what is the society of dragons like in your world? Are these incredibly ancient, incredibly powerful beings so isolationist that they don't know of each other's existence? If they do know of each other's existence, arguably they're the only ones that could pose any kind of threat to one another. So what is the balance of power, and how is that maintained? Those are questions that, well, if you've answered, then you've got a much richer campaign world where there's a lot more potential for the dragons to use the player characters to go and assassinate another dragon, to shift the balance of power in their direction. These are not creatures whom, by general expectation, are going to make rash decisions. They live for an incredibly long time. They have seen the rise and fall of species. Humans' lives flitter by in seconds. Elves are perhaps the only peer that matches them in terms of their longevity. So their plans will be incredibly, incredibly complex and incredibly subtle. Dragons, for all of the power that they have, if they make a move, other dragons arguably are going to push back. Or are they? Again, that boils down to your setting, so it's something that you need to consider. And if you have dragons willy-nilly just destroying human civilizations, why don't the humans or the elves or the orcs or whomever it happens to be go to these incredibly powerful creatures and say, we will give you everything we have if you just side with us during this next battle? If dragons are mindless beasts that just basically are like giant tigers or panthers that can breathe fire or acid or lightning or magic or whatever it is that your dragons can breathe, then it's a different story. They're harnessed. One could argue, why aren't they bred in captivity? Well, for the same reason that we don't really domesticate tigers or lions. They simply can't be domesticated. They're too unreliable. Their nature is too strong to make them completely reliable pets for a long time. So, how do the dragons interact with one another, and what do they do when one dragon does something, when the fabric of the balance starts to be pulled in one direction or another? If you follow the traditional Dungeons and Dragons setup, where the dragons are aligned to specific virtues, or good dragons are gold or silver, or brass are more neutral, and red are evil, and green are lawful evil, all those kinds of details, they are still going to be aware of one another. And the power play that's going to come in is, well, why do they tolerate the lesser races in the first place? Why do they allow elves and humans to propagate and to dominate this space? Those are questions that you need to have answered if you're going to have dragons in your campaign, and you're going to have dragons doing something of value in your campaign. Now, that leads us to then look at something that we have all heard about, and it gets mentioned time and time again in all of the fantasy literature, is dragon magic is much more ancient and much more mystical and powerful than the magic that currently exists. It doesn't matter what fantasy series you watch, the dragon magic is always something that's beyond the comprehension of normal mortals. However, a lot of systems don't like to have a separate magic system just for a species that may or may not feature at the end of a campaign once in a while. So we don't ever really get to grips with dragon magic. And for me, that's a great loss. Now, I'm busy working on the Atlas of my campaign world, the book that I'm hopefully going to release by Christmas, if I can get there, I'm hoping to do so. And in that, will be a section that looks specifically at dragon magic and how powerful it is and how players could ultimately access it, because, well, you want your players to be able to get to that level. Perhaps if you run epic campaigns like I do. But the idea of dragon magic is that it has been crafted and created by beings who don't have the pressure of human mortality, who don't have the elvish predilection for balance or harmony. A red dragon could spend 100 years crafting the perfect spell that manages to curve around other magics, or that has an inbuilt evocation that protects it from being countered by others, magic users, or that allows it to be invisible for the first 5 seconds and then suddenly to materialize, to make it that much more dramatically terrifying for the opponents. We have to bear in mind what the purpose is of these dragons, and if the purpose is like pretty much everybody else on the planet, it is to survive, and they have done so by colonizing or dominating the local area, one has to assume that they're going to employ every skill and power that they have at their disposal to keep them in that place. And that means dragon magic needs to be particularly terrifying. So all of my dragons that players encounter, I don't look at the monsters' manuals which suggest, oh, the dragon can cast 5 of these and 6 of those. But that's what a normal caster can do. We're talking dragon magic. Dragon magic needs to be something more than just fireballs and incantations and that sort of thing. These are powerful, powerful beings. Now, we also need to look at dragon artifacts. If the dragons live for so long and there are magics about that can hurt them or harm them, it makes sense that they will make their own things. Now, oftentimes in fantasy, dragons wear dragon armor as they bear their riders into battle, because of course the giant fire-breathing lizard is the secondary thought as opposed to the squishy human who's riding on top of them. That aside, dragon artifacts need to be taken into account. And again, it's something that you may have already included. A ring that a dragon might wear would be the size of this room to fit on the small finger of a dragon. Now that's a different kind of challenge that your players are going to come across. Oh, you find a magic claw extender. It's 3.5 meters long and weighs a ton. It has +5 to attack. What are you going to do with it? So it raises some interesting questions. It makes your setting feel that much richer, that much more unique, and it makes your beasts, these dragons, feel as if they are a real culture within your space. And that ultimately is the goal, is that the players don't just go, oh yeah, oh, it's a dragon artifact. Oh, has the dragon got any rings on it? Yeah, okay, I'll pick it up and put it on. Well, sure, but your finger is not the circumference of a dragon's finger. You could possibly wear it as a belt, or maybe as a thigh band, or something along those lines. That's entirely up to you as to how big your dragons actually are. So by looking at their society, by looking at their hierarchy, and how they influence one another, and how they consider the lesser races to participate in their world, it starts to create an interesting space to play in. It then starts to ask some interesting questions. When you add dragon magic into the equation, now suddenly you have these different strata of beings. Dragons don't worry about human affairs. They don't worry about what the elves are doing because, well, they're very cute, but their little bodies cannot actually house the capacity to fire off magic spells that are on the same level as the dragons. Dragon magic armor is not just going to give it +3 to its armor class or whatever the spell's power might be. This is a gigantic 100-foot-long creature. That spell is going to protect it from everything that could possibly be thrown at it. And the dragon isn't just going to sit back and go, well, I cast that spell once and it worked quite well, I'm not going to tinker with it. It's going to be an arms race between the dragons to see who becomes the most powerful. That arms race might take place over hundreds of years, but there is still going to be this amount of, well, if he comes up with that, I need to come up with this so that she can do that, so that then, etc., etc., etc. Now, if we then take it further, Dragons are often seen as having these entourages. They live in mysterious caves or citadels or forest keeps that have been forged out of giant redwood trees or in the hearts of volcanoes. Wherever your dragon so chooses to live, they will usually have an entourage. Now, of course, dragons, like gods, can transform themselves into everyday mortals so that they might walk amongst the people. I'm not entirely sure why they would. Maybe if you had the capacity to walk amongst mice and listen to their petty conversations about getting out of the maze, you might do that once or twice, but after a while it'll get boring, especially in comparison to what you're thinking about and what you're doing. And since it's just cyclical, we know human nature it's the same stuff. We really haven't come up with anything new in the past 5,000 years. It's all just rehashed, rethought out, but it's the same stuff, really. Let's be honest. If you're a long-lived creature, again, there's going to be very little interest in wandering around. Oh, look at that human. He's so different from the last one. Instead of being in love with his sister, he's now in love with his mother, or whatever the story is. The dragon's not going to be too interested, but they might have entourages and they might have a desire to play with the lesser races. So they might act as advisors to kings, in which case maybe they'll transform down so the king can have a decent conversation with them, but they might have a retinue or minions that might work for them or work with them. And that's something that you need to think about, is what are those kind of people, and are they proud to serve the dragon? Are they husks that are simply dominated by the dragon's supreme will? There are many options that are available to you. Again, though, it goes back to how do the dragons perceive the smaller races, the long-lived elves, the short-lived humans, the gnomes, the dwarves. How do they perceive them? Do they perceive them as having value, in which case then they might treat their minions with a bit more respect, or do they just dismiss them as being inconsequential? How they do that and what they think about that will determine how they then use those races for negotiations. It gives you, as the game master, an incredible amount of opportunity to have people who work for dragons who maybe don't know about it, or maybe they do know about it, and they want to progress further along and ingratiate themselves with the dragon. What are they going to do to impress a dragon? Let's be honest, really, what are they going to do? So it gives you this impetus for your NPCs now to have very different motivations, which of course gives you the whole option, and this is what I always look for when I'm creating and looking at monsters, a whole lot of narrative options in terms of creating story. Well, here's a minion of a certain dragon, and he wants to prove his worth by retrieving a lost dragon artifact. He now goes to the party to try and beseech them to help him to do that. That's a great quest, especially when the dragon arrives, looks at the artifact, takes the artifact, and squishes the minion, because the minion knew about the artifact but didn't tell the master. And what if another dragon had got there first? Now there's another interesting plot twist. What if another team arrives at the same time? They're also serving a giant dragon who wants the similar artifact. All those kind of wonderful things come up. Now, narratively, of course, we have to look at these great beasts and play them accordingly. If they're ancient, if they are integrated into the machinations of the world, one has to bear in mind, of course, that a dragon, if they've been going for 500, 600, 700 years, that's longer than a lot of empires have existed for on Earth. So a dragon has the capacity to have been at the very beginning of a civilization, to have watched it crawl from being herders and hunter-gatherers to building castles. A dragon could very well have manipulated the entire society to develop itself around a specific point, or could be actively manipulating against another dragon who's trying to manipulate the culture. However it is unlikely that dragons would have excluded themselves from these little people, the elves, the dwarves, the gnomes, the humans, whoever is in your campaign world. It is unlikely that they would have excluded themselves from these individuals who have the capacity to destroy them. So there has to be some kind of balance. What is that balance in your world? What keeps the lesser races from simply going, we can't have these tremendous threats looming over us. These ancient dragons of supreme power cannot possibly be allowed to exist. We must destroy them. And, well, mechanically you can do it. In most systems there are ways of killing dragons. So what kept that balance in check? What kept that balance in place? And that's something interesting to look at and understand. Now, of course, the other big thing about a dragon is its lair. We've touched on it in terms of where its lair might be, but in terms of how it defends its lair, in terms of who is meant to have access to its lair. Does it have human-friendly steps? If this creature is 100 foot long, its rooms are going to be at least 300, 400, 500, 600 foot long, and the ceilings are going to be 200 foot up into the air. So are they going to take into account the lesser races? And if they do, is it an excluded side area? Or is it, well, you just wander around, and if you happen to be stepped on, I'm awfully sorry, but you're 20 foot, 30 foot, 40 foot below me. I really don't notice you. So what are their lairs like from the perspective of this massive beast? And that's something that in the literature that I've read is often overlooked, is that the sheer scale of beasts. Now, if you look at, say, for example, that horrific movie, The Desolation of Smaug, the Hobbit trilogy, there we had this large space with this gigantic dragon, and the interplay between the Hobbit and the dragon I thought worked out fairly well. That was the actual only part of the movie that I really enjoyed. But there it was a sense of scale. And that's something that Peter Jackson and The Lord of the Rings got right, was this massive, massive scale of these beasts. And that's something that needs to be presented to your players. They need to get the sense that these are terrifically large creatures of power. So, of course, how do we now use these dragons in our campaign? We've come up with all the ecology, we've come up with the cultures, we've come up with all of these interesting little points that we needed to ponder. How do we now use them? Do we use them as our big bad? Do we use them as the reason that there is a big bad? This arch-lich wants to take over a dragon, or create a Dragolich, or a Dracolich, or whatever. Is there a... How are they involved? What will they do if the outcome happens? Are there dragons working for that outcome and working against it? Do they even know about it? And once they do, what are they going to do about it? Are they going to interfere, or are they going to let it play out its course? Again, depending on the answers to the previous points that we've been looking at, depends on how they're going to integrate. Now, they could also be used as a guiding hand. So there's an old dragon who sees that there is a rise for power in the west, and that the east is starting to dwindle or just be complacent. Perhaps it goes to offer its advice because it likes the Eastern culture more than the Western culture, or whatever the motivation. So they could act as guides, they could act as advisors to the king. They could also act as a force of one side or the other, in which case then, why are they doing it? What could they possibly get out of it? And that is something that you have to answer. Because if there is this large dragon and it's working for an evil creature, the evil creature needs to be more powerful than the dragon. Otherwise, why is the dragon working for it? If the dragon is the most powerful of the entities involved, why is it not the big bad? What's the relationship? So again, answering those questions allows you to create a much more interesting and complex end solution. What if the dragon is playing along with the lich? Yes, I will serve you and provide you with my knowledge, because I want to see what type of magic you're going to come up with, and if it's of use to me, I will snap you like a twig and take it for myself. Now that's an interesting plot twist. The heroes have been fighting against this lich, The lich now has a confrontation with the heroes. Your players think that they've come to the end of the campaign after only 6 months of playing. You have a smirk upon your face. The dragon launches itself over the lich as if it's about to come and rain down death and fire upon your players' characters. They have all the dragon defenses and they have all the lich defenses ready. And as the dragon reaches its azimuth, the lich starts opening up spells upon the party so that the party has some opportunity to attack the lich. They release all of their magic onto the lich, and the lich starts to drop to one knee because you want your players to feel as if they are victorious. And then suddenly the dragon lands on the lich and swallows him. And then looks at the party and says, "Go away." He takes the artifact and he leaves. Now the party realizes this is a much bigger campaign. And the dragon is much more terrifying than that lich that we thought was actually the big bad. So by working out how your dragons fit into the world, you can craft very specifically how your dragons will interact with the storyline and what they will do to that storyline that you are busy giving your players to create a much more interesting outcome. And that, at least, is my opinion on dragons. These remarkable, remarkable creatures. I absolutely love them. The campaign world that I've set up, just to give you an example, the dragons were supreme overlords over all of Braxia. The entire planet was ruled by dragons, and each dragon had a territory, and they would have skirmishes between one another. Not themselves, mind you. They're far too sophisticated to risk death and injury in actual combat between themselves. They would field armies of elves and dwarves and humans that they would send off to have battles, much like the Greek city-states used to have on Earth many, many thousands of years ago. The lesser races decided that this was not necessarily the best option for them as a species, and so they created this amazing spell, which was a divine spell plus a magic spell, and the human and dwarvish armies had to attack the dragons at the same time, and they managed to release this amazing divine, magical, arcane spell which banished all of the dragons into a pocket dimension just outside of the realm of Braxia. And they sealed that pocket dimension by placing anchors all over Braxia. Now these anchors prevent dimensional travel, so there's no such thing as dimension gate or teleportation. None of that works in Braxia. And there's a whole lot of organizations that make sure that those anchors remain in place, because if the anchors were to fall, the dragons would return, and return with vengeance. So that is the premise of the world that I have created. I looked at dragons and went, I want them to be the ultimate big bad. But over a course of multiple adventures, dozens of adventures, we learn that there's far more to this plot, to this alternate dimension that the dragons have been cast to, that then meets the eye. We learn of all of the different organizations, obviously, who are trying to bring the dragons back. And there's organizations trying to prevent the dragons from coming back. So there is this very complicated balance of power, as well as all of the usual stuff that goes on in a fantasy world. But the idea was to look at what happens when an entire planet is liberated from an oppressor on such a scale as the dragons. So Braxia is in a state of peace. The orcs, the goblins, the humans, the dwarves, the elves, the drow, everybody is in a state of peace. And of course, as the campaign starts, that peace starts to break and crack, and all sorts of other things happen as well. But the idea was, my dragons are supremely powerful. Just as an idea, from a mechanical perspective, it's a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we played it in Pathfinder as well. All I do for the ancient magic, and this is not my ultimate solution is to actually create a separate magic system altogether for them, or to find someone who's already done it. I'm sure they have. Generally speaking, what I do with my dragons is dragon magic allows them to cast 2 spells at exactly the same time, so the spells have a double effect. So it might be an invisible fireball spell that suddenly just explodes in the middle of nowhere because they don't see where it's coming from, or that it explodes and makes everything that it touches invisible. All those kinds of wonderful and amazing things. But it is also, because it is ancient, powerful dragon magic, it just does times 10 damage. So whatever the damage would normally be, times it by 10, and now it's dragon magic. Now it's this ancient, powerful magic. But all of that has a strain on the user, and takes a certain amount of toll, which, anyway, I didn't plan on telling you any of that, so that's all extra stuff. Anyway, let me know what you think about monsters and you, and whether I should go through things like vampires, undead, witches, ghouls, all the wonderful things that we have, from a potential to make them interesting and unique in your campaign world. Because I think that just taking the monster straight out of the book, although it's good because it allows people to understand what they are attacking or coming under attack from, to give it your own twist just makes it that much better and that much more interesting to play in your world. Anyway, until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of these monsters and you in the great GM space in this video section. And if you haven't had a look yet on the channel, we've got Great Player coming out tomorrow, and of course then on Fridays now is For Your Consideration, which is where I unpack a thought or an idea for the weekend that allows you to then use that in your role-playing sessions on a Friday night, Saturday night, or a Sunday night. Anyway, until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming.